Some of you might have come across the fact that there is of course, one might add, an internet meeting place for people with autism in all its many forms. It's called wrongplanet.net. And it's, of course, a way of summarizing the autistic experience. That is, sometimes we really sit down and wonder, why are we here? This is, of course, especially when we think about the fact that it's sometimes complicated being autistic. It leads to a lot of stress, and in some cases, you could say that if you really want to function, you actually need medication to do so. In some cases, you could say that you need the medication because of not your problems, but the differences of other people, which is a fascinating point. But it does give rise to the discussion as to why are we here? Why are we part of humanity? And in some cases, of course, there is speculation that, well, it might be an evolutionary phenomenon. We are here because it's time, or something like that. And there is, of course, the fascinating aspect that one might consider that throughout evolution, the flock modules of the brain, those that keep people locked into prioritizing hierarchical position, socio-emotional belongingness, reproduction, not the least, so on and so forth, are intact throughout the constantly increasing sophistication and complication of the human brain until something weird happens, at which point the cogitation modules seem to take precedence over the flock modules, and the person in question, the Homo sapiens aspergensis, it's a joke, immediately sits down and tries to socialize with the nearest computer. Which of course does make sense, because after all, let's face it, computers are made by autistics for autistics. That's why normal people sometimes find them difficult to understand. We don't, but again, it is possible. I've been thinking of writing a crime drama where the point is that Asperger's constructed computers as a subtle way to take over world power, even though we are few in numbers. But the next question then becomes, does this mean that, as one of my colleagues loves to say when she finishes her lectures, she's also autistic, yes, what we are considering is that it might be an evolutionary phenomenon that will end up that in 200 years you will be the people requiring special education, schools and facilities. I don't think we'll end up quite with that, but there is actually the interesting phenomenon also that we are increasing in numbers. This is not due to vaccine, or as a very fascinating Danish medical study has suddenly displayed, there is an observation that apparently only applies to Denmark, that male circumcision and autism seem to be connected in some fashion, but only with Danes. The Japanese continue at the same rate as the rest of the world to become autistic, regardless of not only the fact that they were somewhat reluctant going on about the measles, etc. vaccine, but also the fact that Japanese are not strong adherents of circumcision. We might say Danes are not that strong adherents either, so one wonders why the figures point in that direction, but again, we can also say, yes, well, one of the fascinating questions of this time in human civilization is that when we talk about evidence-based things, we have to consider that the way we talk about them, the less evidence-based actually becomes. But the fact is, at least, that we seem to be here to stay, and the increase in autism is not just a matter of people being diagnosed because we live in a very socio-emotionally demanding culture in these years, but also that in some cases you can pinpoint specific geographical locations that seem to have bona fide increases in autism, especially in Silicon Valley in the United States and in the lovely state of Colorado, which is very well known because it's nicely situated for attracting high-level technological industry. And this is, of course, important because if you have a nice young Asperger man who comes across a nice young Asperger woman, they might actually get together and have nice young Asperger children. So there might be actually certain reservations for us where we can increase the plan of taking over the world, or something like that. I could also say that either there's something specifically going on, obviously not circumcision, since we are getting more and more women with autism, but also it means that we might simply be getting much better at identifying female autism. In Denmark, at present, the going rate is that the children's psychiatry facilities now diagnose 1 girl per 2 boys. So when they come and say, I'm worried that I'll never find a girlfriend, how can I say, well, time is in your favor. But this also means that we have a situation where people have fundamentally different ideas of what's basically right or wrong, up and down. And this is one of my absolute favorites, Escher, of course, because this is really where we can see the idea of coexistence of people who have 2 fundamentally different experiences of being in the world. The idea of sitting down and say, okay, but which is the right up in this picture is, of course, not something that makes sense. So the fascinating question then becomes, how do we facilitate coexisting with people who simply experience, metaphorically speaking, that even basic stuff such as the law of gravity is different? And how do we perhaps even make something positive out of it? If you ever tried doing any form of redecoration work in your living quarters, you will have had the experience of trying to paint the ceiling. This is where either your glasses or your eyes get covered in paint. So if we stick with this gravitational metaphor, you could say, well, wouldn't it be nice if we have people who live 90 degrees changed from us so that we can coordinate who's painting what, and that means none of us will get paint on our glasses or in our eyes, but nevertheless all the surfaces of the room will get painted. But that's, in a way, it's of course impossible in the literal sense, but I'm hoping that actually it's more possible in the metaphorical sense. So how do people with autism experience communication? It's not just a matter of their communication, but also our communication. What we do is actually, we experience communication as authentic. We mean what we say what we mean. And we don't really do pretense, except in cases where we try to please neurotypicals. Communication to us is data-oriented. I am what in the Harry Potter universe would be called pure blood. I have 2 autistic parents. And when I talk to my father on the phone, who is approaching 80, it's still the bye. We love each other dearly, but we know that already, so it's not really necessary to keep repeating the fact. Which is also something that sometimes female members of the audience can recognize. Yes, my husband's not very good at telling me that he loves me. And then the husband will protest and say, well, I told you the day we got married, if I've changed my mind, I'll let you know. We are rather direct. We get to the point at once, if we can help it. And we are very verbal, which means that we don't feel so strong a need for gestures or facial expressions, which, of course, especially in the case of the old telephone, was in certain ways rather practical. On the other hand, we also have quite a few of us who are not that keen on talking on the phone because there is the problem that you can't see when people are getting ready to say something. So this is why, by the way, Baron Cohen's autism quotient questionnaire has the idea of, I'm never sure when it's my turn to talk on the phone. You could say that, well, I'm not quite sure that neurotypicals are sure either, but it doesn't seem to bother them as much. Also, of course, on the phone, we do notice one thing immediately, which is Jim Sinclair's wonderful observations that NTs have a hard time getting to the point, as he says. And our experience of neurotypical communication then becomes that it's a rather foggy experience, and as you can see, also something that might actually have scary undertones. It's always characterized by having several layers. This is where we talk about reading or listening, it might be, between the lines. And that means that content is what's being meant. And this is rarely equal to what's actually being said, which is a rather fascinating phenomenon. We have to listen for what people are meaning, not what they're actually saying. You could say, wouldn't it be more practical if they just said what they were trying to communicate? And what they are trying to communicate may actually be very vague, especially if they don't quite have the words, and that means that they are desperately appealing to context. So you get, you know, like, sort of, ish, and no end of unfinished sentences, where autistics do have a strong urge to finish unfinished sentences, which rarely is the direct way to winning popularity contests. Neurotypicals are not always data-oriented. Why did you call? Why did you want to say something? Well, they're not always quite sure, because in the end, their purpose might well be socializing and not the mere distribution of data. There is also the indirect thing that you have to, as we talked about earlier on, you have to establish slowly the social setting, the metaphorical room wherein communication takes place. The message is conveyed, if there is a message apart from socialization. And finally, of course, there is the multimedia show that is sometimes overwhelming, and when you stop being overwhelmed, it's simply quite fascinating to observe the way people use so many things such as tone of voice. And that's again back to the idea of, if I want to try being a very sensitive neurotypical, I can say, oh, I can say that you seem a bit stressed out today. And you will notice that my voice is going softer. I'm simply increasing the flow of air so it sounds more gentle. I'm also increasing the tonality of the voice, making it sound more gentle and soothing, as opposed to commanding. Hey, buck up! That sort of thing is quite in the opposite direction. Finally, there is the fascinating idea that if I'm really trying to help people feel safe, I'm also trying slowly to raise my hand, and I have to do so slowly and elegantly because I'm trying to hint that if we were closer, I would place my hand reassuringly on your shoulder. But since we are not that close, I'm simply making a gesture implying that amount of closeness. So if you want to try to create a comfortable atmosphere for someone who is not feeling all that well at the moment. These are the sorts of things that you have to coordinate in order to convey the actual message through all the channels necessary. And this is something you also have to tell autistics, because once they start decoding, they sometimes get carried away. I can see this or that emotion. And if the person is distraught, it's not necessarily the most sensitive way of stating, I can see you're distraught, that sort of thing. You need to have the, I can see that, so on and so forth. Also, the reason why you say things or ask questions can be quite fascinating. If one of these young ladies says to the other one, how many shifts did you get? An autistic person would say, okay, she's eliciting information. But actually, in a neurotypical world, she might be in a friendly fashion inquiring, are you happy with the number of shifts you got? Or she might actually be both complaining a bit, but also being ready to get hostile, because I'm certainly not happy with the number of shifts I got, and I'm checking to see whether you got preferential treatment. Might be in that simple question. So this is why family therapy arose, because not even neurotypicals always feel safe around so many fascinating undercurrents in their communication. And sometimes their communication is not very efficient at all, but the point is that they have been resonating with each other, so they have been compensating for not very well functioning communication, perhaps for years, until their communication became so problematic that they couldn't compensate through feeling and through adjusting emotionally anymore. And this is, of course, the nightmare that we psychologists have, because there are people who simply say, I don't do couples therapy anymore, because when they finally come to the couples therapist, it's usually too late. So yes, it would be nice if people had the same idea of taking care of their family as they do of their car, and say, okay, once a year we simply do a checkup with a family therapist to see how are we actually doing. Is our communication working smoothly, or is something going somewhere? How do you comfort people is also a very fundamental thing, but it's not necessarily the same thing regarding the person you're trying to comfort, because if it's a neurotypical person, not rarely that person would like you to come closer, to touch, to inquire as to the person's emotional state. How are you feeling? That sort of thing. People with autistic features might not prefer that approach. They might actually like you to, even if it's not a conflict where you are going, okay, I'm going low arousal, but you might simply say, okay, increase the distance so the person does not have to deal with someone else, to relate to someone else. And sometimes it might be practical, instead of trying to comfort the person, you might be very practical if you simply take care of chores or something that might actually be an extra stress factor in their lives. So you can do that and give them extra space at the same time. Interestingly, by the way, this is also something that's very culturally specific, because in the Western world, the idea of getting closer is much appreciated. But in Japan, they all actually seem to have a certain preference for the autistic thing. If I can see someone being very sad, I will turn away, not because I'm coldly ignoring the person, but because the person feels that through lack of self-control, he or she is losing face. And if I pretend not to see it, I'm actually helping the person, because if I don't see it, it's not happening, and that means that the person can try to compose him or herself without the additional bother of, oh my God, I'm losing face at the same time. There is also the question of how do you express love? Now, I've been working for quite some years as a family therapist, and what really struck me was the fascinating diversity of ways people can express love. In some families, you express love by cooking wonderful meals. But that also means that the family members are actually obliged to eat the meals. So what do you do if you also have a way of expressing love that says, I'm concerned about you gaining weight? And this is where, in some cases, you can say, okay, this is actually the recipe for bulimia, because people have to eat, but they can't increase weight. So the only way of doing that is actually by eating and then vomiting afterwards. So sometimes it's amazing what you do and what is never actually being said, but being quietly assumed that, well, this is my way of expressing love, and of course that's what everybody does, isn't it? In some cases, in autistic things, you might see, okay, there's less cuddling, there's less soothing voices, but people might spend a lot of time, if the child has expressed a long-time desire for a tree house, you might simply use no end of time and money building that tree house, because this is something that would really mean something to the person. So in some cases, in autistics, you need to look for acts rather than moods being created. And that means that sometimes when you do couples therapy with a mixed marriage, where one of the persons involved is an autistic and the other one is not, what you also have to do is to simply point out that there are different ways of expressing love, which also means that you have to be very conscious of this fact so that you can see what sort of manifestations of the other person's love have I overlooked, and even worse, have I failed to take in because I didn't recognize them as expressions of love, which means that the other person who offered an expression of love actually really felt neglected, put down in that respect. So again, the idea of trying to understand what's it like in your version of the world is extremely important. The same thing also goes with what you do with autistics who are underinformed. They start to fret, and that's actually not completely foreign to non-autistics, because some of you who are safely non-autistics might have tried somewhere standing at, for instance, a railway station, wondering when the train is going to arrive, because it's actually supposed to have left 7 minutes ago. And there's no message coming out from the loudspeakers, there's no little sign saying, presumed delay 7 minutes. Nothing is happening. If this goes on for about 15 minutes more, that's when you can see all sorts of non-autistic people starting to engage in behavior that in autistics is called stimming, because they feel more and more stressed out. And the thing you're not supposed to do when you're running a railway station is to grab the microphone and then, instead of giving them information about when does the bloody train leave, say, well, there's no need to get all excited, people. Things are under control. It'll work out eventually. They'll not calm down by that, I can assure you. Okay, so when autistics socialize, what do they socialize about when they're not playing croquet, chess, things like that? Well, they actually share special interests. Sometimes you get very lucky and say, okay, oh, you're into, in my case, for instance, martial arts. Also, fine, okay, next 6 hours taken care of. But sometimes it's something where you can say, I'm not really that interested in your special interest, but it's wonderful to talk to someone who has a special interest, who has something that can take up that life close to completely. Because I understand people with special interests more than I understand people who don't have special interests, or at least a longing for, I want to have a special interest, but I can't find it. I haven't found it yet, that sort of thing. We also share our experiences with the neurotypical world. Are you also close to strangling them when this or that happens? Some people would say, oh, so that's actually the autistic version of small talk. Yes, possibly. We also share our solutions to practical problems. You can have people saying, oh, that's a lovely jacket, where did you get that? In our case, it's usually, oh, that's an efficient earplug, where did you get that? Because in very many cases, we're very sensitive to sound. In some cases, we do have exceptional hearing, but usually we have bad sound filters. So if we sit down 6 people together, usually there will be 2 or 3 conversations going on at the same time. The autistic person can hear all of them with the same intensity, which makes it very difficult to find out which conversation am I actually a part of. And it also means that if I'm talking to one person, there will be at least one reason why I'm looking at that person's mouth instead of eyes. Number 1, I might not be comfortable with looking into people's eyes. Number 2, they might not give me the amount of information I need. But especially in that setting, if I look at the way people's mouths are moving, I can see whether the movements fit the sound, and that means I can identify the conversation that I'm a part of by looking at their mouths. This, of course, means that after 30 minutes conversing in that fashion, I'll be completely drained of energy. There's also the fascinating thing that since we comprise only 1 to 2% of the population, it does get somewhat lonely. But do autistics get lonely? Well, yes, but some of them don't really discover it until very late in their lives, because they find out that when they are with other people, who are usually non-autistic people, they don't feel all that connected to them. So it doesn't assuage anything to be with non-autistic in the same fashion. But sit down and talk with fellow autistics for 30 minutes who also have weird experiences with the neurotypical world, and you'll start really feeling a belongingness. So this is my world. These are the other people who were scattered when the spaceship crashed and on the wrong planet, that sort of thing. So what we do share there is actually our experience of being normal, of, oh yes, they do that a lot, don't they? And in several cases, we share the relief and closure brought by being diagnosed. For several years, as I said, one of my special interests is martial arts, especially Japanese martial art called Aikido. I was a member of a dojo for many years where we had a tendency to sit down after practice and make tea, Japanese of course, and talk about mainly Aikido, of course, but also other things, and we could go on for hours. It later turned out, what we didn't know, but this group of people who sort of gravitated there, quite a few of us actually had Asperger's diagnoses. And of those who didn't have it at the time, several got it later on. And one evening, there was one of the members, young girl, age 19, who came in and she was almost bursting, you know, that one, yes. And okay, let's hear it. I got my diagnosis today, she said. And that's why we all immediately, spontaneously shouted, congratulations, oh, that's wonderful. And of course we started laughing and say, well, it's not quite usual to have people come in and say, I've got a chronic psychiatric diagnosis. Oh, congratulations, that sort of thing. But in our world, the idea is it does give much relief, much closure. It explains so many things of the past 20, 30, 40, how many years of your life, where you can say, oh, all the pieces are starting to fit together. And this is, of course, also where we said, well, we did have a tradition that once you got a black belt degree, you were supposed to bring cake. And so the idea was, yes, perhaps we should make it a fixture of this dojo, this Aikido club, that there are 2 reasons for giving cakes or bringing donuts or something of the sort. Number 1, when you get a black belt, and number 2, when you get a diagnosis. We do have this belonging problem. Sometimes we find semi-areas of belonging. You might be familiar with the existence of something called Mensa. It's a sort of social club for people with high IQs. And you can say, well, what sort of people go there? Well, they must be very narcissistic, mustn't they? Not really, because narcissists will say, oh, I thought about joining the Mensa, but I'm not sure I want to be with people whose only fascinating feature is that they are intelligent. It's not enough for me, because inside they're scared of failing the test. Other people will say, well, I'm not applying because I don't think I'm that intelligent. And some of the people will find out I'm different than other people and I think a lot, so perhaps it's because I'm very intelligent. They'll do the test, they'll often pass the test, and they'll join the club, and they'll find out, oh my God, I have other intelligent people who are like me. Yes, because they are like you not just in being intelligent, but also in looking for somewhere to belong. So, yes, to a certain extent, Mensa is an Asperger reservation. In Denmark, we had a very long-standing tradition that a very disproportionate amount of the members of Mensa were people working as postmen. You can say, does delivering mail in Denmark require exceeding intelligence? No, but people who were delivering mails in some cases were actually people who liked the idea of having a very firm and established and predictable route they followed around, meeting the same people without too many social obligations and that sort of thing. So, do the math. In some cases, we'd actually like to join in, but we also know that when we behave naturally, that sometimes is not very well received. In some cases, there is a joke, well, last time I behaved naturally, they took me to the psychiatry ward and gave me a diagnosis. So I'm not sure whether that's all that practical. In some cases, there is also the interesting fact that we need to be by ourselves, even if our company consists of good, sound autistics. And this is something that people can experience as being they can feel rejected by our need to be alone sometimes. And the idea that sometimes we also need to control the amount of social interaction means that the internet is really God-given for us, because it's a safe, well, not that safe in other respects, of course, but it's a you can control, you can shut down communication when you want to, so in that respect it becomes a safe way of communicating, which means that quite often we socialize via the internet. Many adolescents I've talked to have said that, well, my best friend is this or that person who is so and so old, and by the way, who lives in Alberta, Canada, which is far away if you're living in Denmark. And yes, they haven't seen each other in real life, but they know just as much about each other as people who have known their counterparts in real life since kindergarten, because it's the quality of the interaction, not the quantity or the geographical proximity, that determines the essence of a friendship. And in some cases, even of a romantic relationship. I have a boyfriend. Oh, I've never seen him. Right. This does not mean necessarily that he doesn't exist. Oh, yeah, I see. Where did you come across? Well, he's a 250-year-old vampire. That's where we'll say, okay, either you are having a psychosis or else you are writing the follow-up to the Twilight Saga. But the idea of socializing via a means of interaction that is that you can actually comprehend, that does not become overwhelming, is very important to people with autism. But this, of course, is something that NTs find concerning. Again, the reason why I've talked to so many adolescents who've had very good friends that they only know via the internet is because I've talked to very many concerned parents who say, I'm very concerned because all he or she does is lock himself in his room, and he doesn't really come out and he doesn't really want to talk to us that much. So I'm very worried that he'll be isolating himself and he'll go into some sort of fetal position, and in the end he'll be unable to unfold his arms and legs. Right, I say. What does he do in that room? Well, he doesn't talk about it very much. Oh, do you ever hear anything from that room? Yes. I'm not listening at the doors, of course, but sometimes I can't help overhearing when I'm passing in the hallway that actually he seems to be having quite a lot of fun. He's laughing and talking to people. Do you have any idea whether these people exist? Oh, yes, he knows them via the internet because they're playing, World of Warcraft. Right. And does he do that often? Oh, yes, 2 or 3 hours every day, every afternoon. Right. So what you're saying is actually that if he was in that room with 3 other youngsters and they were playing perhaps a computer game, but sitting physically in the same room, everything would be perfectly all right. Yes, I suppose that's what I'm saying. Okay, so actually he is socializing, but he's socializing in a somewhat different manner than people of our generation. I came across a non-autistic young girl at some point who was 12 years old, and she liked dressing up with her best friend. But due to reasons of logistics, they couldn't always be together, so they were Skyping and playing, dress-up games via the computer. And at some point, her father observed her going through the house with the computer, keyboard like this, screen like that. And he said, "What are you doing?" "Well, I'm showing Janet our house." All right, there's the webcam. And of course, if she were going around the house with Janet beside her, no one would have batted an eyelid because, okay, of course she's showing her the house. So there is also the interesting question that says, how much of this is also specifically autistic, and how much of it is simply an especially attractive open door for autistics who now get an opportunity that they actually didn't have 30 years ago. Because 30 years ago, when they wanted to socialize, they had to get out physically among people with loud noises, loud music that you couldn't turn down. One of the benefits of the internet. So I think that this is where you need to be very investigative before saying, oh, they have to get away from that screen. Of course, they shouldn't be there for 24 hours every day, but some screen time is actually extremely beneficial. And then, of course, there is the interesting question that said, if you want to get them away from the screen, you have to also figure out what are you going to suggest that they do. Because otherwise, there is this wonderful cartoon, Calvin and Hobbes, the little boy with the tiger. There is one wonderful strip where he's sitting and playing checkers with his stuffed tiger, and his mother appears and says, "What are you doing inside? It's such lovely weather. You should be outside. Oh, come on, get out, into the garden." And then you see them getting thrown out into the garden with 2 small jackets. And final picture, you see them sitting, playing checkers, wearing small jackets outside in the garden. And this is sometimes the experience that autistics get when people say, "Oh, you spend too much time in front of that screen. What am I supposed to do now?" Of course, it's getting less and less widespread because now the parents are too busy watching their little screens to take notice of, well, you know what I'm saying. One of the things that people notice about social behaviors in NTs is that they seem to touch each other quite a lot. And this is not as bad in countries such as Denmark as it is in Portugal. People who barely know each other can't have a conversation in Portugal without actually small amounts of touching going on at least every 3 minutes. But this is in no way a romantic situation. In Denmark, it would be considered grossly romantic, and therefore people would start considering the appropriateness of it. So this, of course, is where you really start thinking, okay, if we think we have a hard time being autistic in Denmark, it's really scary to imagine being in Portugal. I haven't seen the statistics for Portugal. Maybe they've all escaped to Denmark. Another thing that we notice is that neurotypical people tend to be rather economical with the truth, as Margaret Thatcher once put it. It's easier to train autistics to do white lies than to do darker lies, not to mention pretense. In the end, as I said earlier on, there is the idea that truth is actually something sacred in the autistic world. And that means that autistics have to learn to lie. They have to learn not to say anything when they might else be very tempted to say something, and so on and so forth. This does not mean that they are not able to do so. After all, we are now in Sweden, which is the home country of several well-known people from the fictional world, including not only Saga Norén, but also Lisbeth Salander. And one of the fascinating things about Lisbeth Salander is that due to her life experiences, she develops a psychopathic component on top of her Asperger syndrome, which, as Stieg Larsson perfectly explains it, is she still lives by a moral code, and she is completely uncompromising, but it's her own moral code, which is not always quite consistent with Swedish legislation. So you might have autistics who become adept at lying because they will formulate ethical considerations which legitimize lying. It's easier if you teach them the white lies by saying, well, grandmother is not what she used to be in the kitchen, and so we say, oh, thanks for a lovely meal, even though it was perhaps not all that lovely anymore, not to hurt her feelings. That's where autistics can say, okay, I buy that. I accept that this is a case where emotional considerations are actually worth weighing against the idea of the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. A sentence so precise that one is tempted to consider whether the person who originally phrased that sentence perhaps had Asperger syndrome. That is perhaps one of my other special interests, post-mortem diagnosis of Asperger's. There is also the innate capacity within neurotypicals to be very economic in regard to rules. One of the things that autistic people share is the special parking habits of neurotypicals. It's enough that not always are the cars parked with precision, but in some cases you actually get a double tap, as in this case, where not only is it not parallel with the lines, but this person is also occupying 2 parking spaces, which points towards greed. This is injustice, and injustice is almost up there with untruth in the catalogue of sins in the autistic world. So looking at this and feeling the righteous anger of Jesus in the temple is a common things that autistics have in common. And of course there is the idea of socialization, where the final explanation has been provided, not surprisingly, by Temple Grandin, who has a very long life's experience of not only understanding what autism is, but also of observing neurotypicals. And one of the mystifying things is this fantastic capacity and need, the urge to socialize just for the sake of socializing. And this is where you can, those of us who really study it never end being fascinated by it. We can say, it's obviously a very fundamental atavistic drive that's going on here, which is interesting because they try to rationalize it later on with logical explanations, which usually don't apply, but we have noticed that several times in the neurotypical world, logical explanations don't quite apply. One of the absolutely wonderful and endearing features of neurotypicals is that they can be also seized by a sudden powerful urge to perform wonderful deeds of prosocial behavior. We perfectly agree with that because the idea of suffering being a bad thing is also a fundamental tenet in the autistic world. But it's because we understand this that we believe it. We don't feel it with the same intensity as neurotypicals do when they suddenly perform a heroic deed. Sadly, there is also the darker side of that coin called antisocial behavior. Sometimes the idea of bothering people just for fun. We're not talking about punishment, we're talking about simply sadistic pleasure. And the widespreadness of this feature is also something that is, well, quite noticeable at least. It's also something that you can say continues into adulthood, not necessarily with the autistic undertones, but at least with the undertones of fear. So this is where we have the famous angry mob playset, you know, torches and pitchforks. Shrek again, by the way. And ogre, grab your torches and pitchforks. So the idea becomes, right, what do we do when we encounter something that's weird, something that's strange? One of the fascinating things is that I've talked to very, very few children who did not experience gross amounts of bullying when they were attending a so-called normal school. And it reached the level where I actually decided, okay, I think I actually need training in EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which is an approach that we normally use for, soldiers coming home from the front lines, firemen who have seen their colleagues burned to death, that sort of thing. And this is also what, at least in Denmark, quite a few autistic children who have attended the Danish normal school system need in order to get rid of their PTSD. And you can say, well, there are many reasons why large and noisy crowds can be unsettling, to say the very least, to autistic people. But quite a few people have also experienced this as part of their upbringing, which means that when people get mad and get murderous, it's not wise to be the weird one in the neighborhood. Okay, so who should I be? Well, actually, there's no shortage of good advice that says, well, don't be anybody, just be yourself. And this is, of course, where the autistic sometimes has the great problem that says, okay, which myself do you want me to be? Because last time I was myself, again, someone gave me a diagnosis. And those of you who have enjoyed the movie The Sixth Sense might remember that there is this young boy who has the problem that I see dead people. And it's a wonderful movie on many accounts. I personally also like it because one of the protagonists is a child psychologist. Doesn't happen very often. Hollywood has not yet discovered the great potential of child psychologists as heroes in movies. But one of the ways that the adults around this boy got worried was because he drew drawings of the dead people he saw. And the psychologist then asked him, okay, so what happened then? Yes, well, then they had a lot of meetings. And then I started drawing no dead people and rainbows instead. Oh, why? They don't have meetings about rainbows. So, pretending to be normal. Why is World of Warcraft such a widespread phenomenon? Now, I'd like to state probably the obvious, which is I don't think that everybody who's playing World of Warcraft is autistic. But again, if we look at the diagnostic perspectives, what we must be aware of is the intensity with which an occupation persists in the life of a person. And if we look at the widespreadness of World of Warcraft in the autistic world, we can say, yes, well, there are actually very well understandable reasons for that, because first of all, we're talking about living a virtual life where you don't have to worry about finding out what do people expect of me, what should my basic values in life be, because they are defined by your allegiance. What are my personal characteristics and skills, and what if I don't really feel I have any skills? What if I don't know who I am? Well, that problem is nicely solved because you're a member of a certain kind of very visible tribe. You can see very clearly the differences between several sorts of people. And sometimes neurotypicals say, well, it would be nice if autistics, had elf-like long ears or something like that, just like Mr. Spock in Star Trek. And sometimes we autistics have exactly the same feeling. It would be nice to be able to recognize each other on the spot instead of having to sometimes wait for something to happen. And also, of course, Mr. Spock, at least in the old tales, did have the luxury of having his own planet. Finally, what do we expect from people in social interactions? Well, that's also defined by the calling that you choose to follow in your life. So you can see who you are, what you are trying to accomplish, and that will be visible also to other people. So it's a world where you don't need to read very much between the lines. Furthermore, you can actually use it as a tool of discovery because you can try the functionality of several roles. What if I were to have this conviction instead of that conviction? What if I were to do this instead of that? And they will still be clearly defined. So it's actually a wonderful developmental tool. But it does not have the same status as I do spiritual something every Tuesday evening. Finally, it's also a wonderful source of communication practice because, first of all, it has a very high degree of verbality. Apart from that, it also operates, you can use speaker, headphone, microphone, that sort of thing, but you can also simply stick to writing, which means that you can engage in the luxury of thinking before you talk. This is something that has been a wonderful consideration for many years. There is a Swedish cartoon called Arne N, who is a sort of the dark side of Donald Duck. And at some point, he shares his philosophical thoughts, where he says, att tänka innan man talar är som att torka sig för man. To think before you talk is to wipe your before you But this does not become a problem in World of Warcraft. Apart from that, if you want to experiment with facial expressions and that sort of thing, and even gestures, you can add clear emotes. There's a function for that. And finally, you can actually have a very visible degree of privacy because your writing will change color depending on what level of privacy you're actually employing at the moment. Still, of course, there is the idea that World of Warcraft might be a special interest for people with autistic tendencies, and it will depend on the intensity. Or it might be so weird that you can say, okay, if you're interested in that, you must be autistic. As I mentioned earlier on, my first university degree was an MA in Latin and English. You can say, okay, how many people were you studying Latin? Yes, well, in my class we were actually 3. At the same time, the classical Greek class consisted of 1 person, and that meant that the entire student body and the entire body of professors could sit around a rather large dining room table at the same time, all classes together. And what sort of people were they? Well, they were the sort of people you might imagine that spend their entire life digging around a language that has stopped being in practical use about 2,000 years ago. There was a very interesting master's thesis I came across where someone was very fascinated by Cicero's use of the genitive case in his letter writing. He spent at least 6 months researching that very subject. So yes, the Asperger quotient was probably very high at that department. Wonderful place. We had small rooms, micro offices we could choose to share. So I've since remember the fact that I had a wonderful time with 2 other people. One was, like myself at the time, an undiagnosed Asperger. The other one was, even at that time, a diagnosed schizophrenic. Highly intelligent, but he didn't count on getting a job because he said, well, actually I can do the stuff, but can you imagine any sort of headmaster who will knowingly hire a person who is defined as a schizophrenic? And yes, I can only say that, well, he was a very lively, intelligent, and considerate person, so I think he would have been a wonderful teacher. And he didn't really have that much contact with psychiatry. So again, this was before people realized that people with diagnoses are more than just weirdos that you prefer not to meet in dark alleys. So if you're not playing World of Warcraft, what sort of special interest might you have? Yes, obviously Latin. You might be interested in trains. When I was myself in sixth form college, high school, my Latin teacher was a person who did exhibit some Asperger traits, apart from the fact that he was formidable when it came to understanding the nuances of a long-dead language. He also had a fantastic fascination with trains. He literally knew the schedule of all the European railways, updated every time in his head. So one of the jokes we sometimes had was during break, we'd say, okay, let's see, today is, that would be Wednesday, and it's now 4 o'clock. If we were to leave right now, when would we be able to be in Naples? They said, okay, right now it will be a 7-minute walk to the bus stop. And the next bus, that would be in 12 minutes' time, so we could actually make that one. Given the fact that it's now 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it means it's rush hour in downtown Copenhagen, so it'll be a few minutes extra in order to reach the central station. Then you need to go this train, you need to change in Hamburg, and then he would come around with the perfect arrival time, plus the corrections you probably need to add in case of springtime, strikes, which are very common with the trained people in Italy. There are several times when they strike. It's also very important to check out what the present situation in the football area is, because some people seem to get very politically conscious if Italy is in the semi-finals of something. So suddenly this train stopped going because people have decided that now is a good time for a political manifestation. He could calculate with that as well. Of course, schedules, maths, astronomy, computer science, that sort of thing. And if we look at the girls, yes, well, an all-time favorite is animals. And of course, as many autistics, not just girls, can point out, animals are very nice to be with because they seem to have fewer hidden agendas. Apart from that, there is manga, anime, there is literature, science, and this is also something that makes it visible, okay, the girls seem to be a bit more subtle in their way of being in the world, which is why it's taken so long to identify them. They don't draw the same amount of attention. They're usually, quiet, serious people. But what has fascinated me is the consideration that special interests is such a fundamental feature with people who are autistic. And I said, what do the neurotypicals actually do? At some point, I'm married for the second time. My first wife was a neurotypical. Not her fault. She was born that way. And there was in Denmark we have the idea that as soon as you become a mother, you're paired up with 2 or 3, sometimes 4 other people in your close area who've also just had a child. And so they have these mother groups established by the healthcare nurse as soon as it's all possible. And so they can actually exchange experience and swap tales of silly husbands, that sort of thing. And at some point, one of these groups, in which my first wife was a part, decided that, well, let's do a social get-together for the whole family, so bring not just the kids, but also the husbands. And this was quite fascinating, because I grew up, among other places, in Copenhagen, which is, at least in Danish terms, a rather large city. And I now live in Odense, which is, although our mayor does have different visions, let's put it at that, a rather small city. And so people also have a slightly more traditional way of living their lives than they do in Copenhagen. And this meant that when time came for this get-together, I noticed that, well, all the men were in the garden. They were surrounding the sacred altar of the barbecue, and I thought, oh yes, but all the years I've been doing martial arts, I've been with neurotypical men, and I get honestly rather bored by what men talk about in dressing rooms. So I thought, well, let's see. I think I'll hang around with the women instead. They were discussing rather traditional subjects. And so it wasn't all that interesting, and apart from that, they kept glancing friendly, but in my direction, where I thought, I think they're trying to say something. And so I decided, okay, what they're saying is probably you're not actively damaging this conversation, but you have a genetic makeup that's not quite compatible with the rest of us. So go find the barbecuers. So I decided to go find the barbecuers, which was also very fascinating because, as I said, this was a rather traditional setting. So as soon as I approached the barbecuing area, well, of course, the master of the house, wearing the compulsory apron as a sign of the authority, that so on and so forth. There was also at least in Denmark, also very necessary small crate of beers. So when I was about, that would be 12 feet away, one of the other men discovered my presence. It must be that neurotypical radar. And so In a rather smooth movement, he simply reached down into the crate, picked up a beer, opened it up, so that by the time I had actually approached him, I was in perfect distance to get the bottle in my hand, which of course was actually a very fascinating metaphorical way of immediately signaling that I was one of the guys and I belonged in that group. So I decided to do what everybody else was doing, which meant that, it was a mobile barbecue. So, of course, the master of the house was in the middle, controlling the results of whatever metaphorical hunt. And that meant that we were actually 4 other people, and since it was mobile, it meant that the thing had wheels. So, yes, 4 men standing around, one hand in the pocket, beer in the other, kicking the wheels, and discussing the classic male subjects of cars and electronic gadgets. Some of you might be wondering, okay, why didn't they also talk about women? Well, obviously, because their wives were not that far away. So this is where you can say, oh my God. It dawned on me then that NTs do have special interests. They are just so widespread that NTs don't consider them special interests. When NT girls reach the age of 12, 13, 14, thereabouts, their brains take a special turn, which autistic girls can tell you all about, and suddenly all they can talk about is boys, clothes, and makeup. And they go on and on and on and on. So they've got 3 special interests. You can talk about them for hours and sometimes for days and nights on end. Have a wonderful time doing nothing but that. But it's normal. If you try talking about Jane Austen's literary productions instead, you're immediately labeled an outsider, perhaps even an Aspie. And this is, of course, the girls. So what, I wonder, do the boys aged 14 and thereabouts talk about and think about? Yes. So, gadgets, cars, and women. And of course, women. And did I mention women? This is also something we talk about in the autistic scene, that this is one of the important explanations, along with that cave thing, you remember. Why do we only comprise 1 to 2% of the population? We've got the wrong special interest. This increases neurotypical breeding rates enormously. So that's why they comprise 98% of the population. We've got the wrong special interests. Okay, so obviously standing around the barbecue is not the way for autistic people to relax. What do we do then? Well, basically, we enter a sort of meditative state, but it usually does not look like that. Sometimes it looks, again, like something much more out of Star Trek. If you want an alternative to Mr. Spock, you can always look at especially the liberated people who come from a Borg environment. And so the idea of being recharged in such a setting is actually not a bad image to carry around. Because yes, autistic people need sleep just like all other human beings, though they're not necessarily all that good at getting their sleep. And this is, among other things, because one of the things that research does show is we have different melatonin metabolisms. So we don't produce quite enough melatonin, and we don't produce it in the amounts necessary at the time necessary. And that means that we sometimes have a hard time getting to bed, and when we finally do, we're exhausted, which means we're very difficult to get up and get to school next morning. But apart from needing sleep, we also need downtime. We need it so badly that sometimes I, in my adulthood, say, okay, I can get by if I slice 1 hour off my sleep. But I can't get by without being extremely stressed if I slice 1 hour off my downtime. So I actually need to stay awake for 1 more hour so that I can reach my quota of downtime, and so that I can actually manage to fall asleep instead of being too agitated to fall asleep because I'm in a very dangerous downtime deficit. Sometimes, okay, you can play computer games if you can find someone else who's awake, but that's the wonderful thing about the internet. There's always someone who's awake somewhere in the world. But apart from that, it might also simply be looking through books, anything of the sort, enough to fulfill the day's quota. And this is something also that I've spent quite a lot of time explaining to parents, that they need at least 1 hour a day of whatever downtime activity they're actually engaging in. The books they read, and whatever they do, provides them with a lot of information. This information means that they will be even better at paying attention to detail. And actually, this is an autistic feature, and you can say, yes, okay, but why do they do it? Well, basically, the impression in the autistic world is we like to get our details straight before calculating the totality. It's called thoroughness, a special autistic word for that. And this, of course, means that, okay, so what do autistics think about the neurotypical approach? Well, they think that neurotypicals do try to intuit the whole thing from a limited set of details, which means that they risk miscalculating, which they actually do quite often. So, apart from the fact that autistics do have an urge to get all the details and to complete whatever it is they're doing, it's also very difficult for them to suspend that urge, because we don't really feel that it's wrong to go through all the details and be completely sure that we've got the entire picture before we start anything. Of course, there comes the fascinating question that says, okay, how many times do you have to recheck the details before even you as an autistic will say, that's enough? It depends. One of the other differences is the fascinating thing that we have noticed that neurotypicals seem to have a sort of built-in gadget that tells them all the time how they're feeling. So apart from the universal, so how are you? Fine. Okay, what happened to your leg? Oh, there's probably nothing. You know, the old Monty Python joke. Man sees another man in the jungle. What happened to your leg? Oh, heavens, I hadn't noticed. Well, if you do find the tiger, would you mind bringing my leg back? Will do, of course. This is extreme Asperger British coolness. And again, as Tony Attwood loves to point out, that was the whole secret behind the British Empire. As soon as they started turning too neurotypical, the empire collapsed. But the idea of knowing how you're feeling is something that's fascinating, because autistics don't normally do that unless we're in some sort of very distressed state. So if someone says, how are you? I'll answer, fine. And if someone says, no, how are you really? Then, I don't know if you ever watch, submarine movies. Our heroes are in a submarine somewhere, and of course, if the movie is supposed to be anything but sailing, Andy Warhol, what you actually need to do is to have some sort of sea battle going on. So the submarine containing our heroes is actually attacked by something. So something goes in the water beside the submarine, which of course means that everything leaks all of a sudden, and so as soon as they have been sailing into smoother waters, you might say, the captain requests a damage report. And this is where people say, okay, torpedo room flooded, not very good, engine room flooded, not very good, hull breach, so on and so forth. Okay, we might as well scuttle the ship now instead of waiting for it to do it all by itself. But the point is that this is what autistics do when they ask how they feel. We go, okay, check, torpedo room, engine, check, okay. And when we've done checking the physical condition, we start checking the mental conditions. How do I feel? Okay, I feel neutral. I don't, none of them feel especially relevant, so nothing to report, which of course means fine, really, translated to NT. You remember the girl I told you about, the one who had the sign language in order to control people's attention? she also was very clear from the start that her normal state of mind was not fine as in +2 on a happiness scale, but the standard autistic fine of neutral. So it became a standing joke during the time I saw her that I said, "So how are you feeling?" And she said with a hint of a smile, "I'm not." Because if I was feeling anything, it would be actually a deviation from the equilibrium situation that she actually preferred, just like many other autistics. So it's not necessarily a bad thing that we don't know how we are feeling. But it is fascinating that neurotypicals are so much in touch with themselves that they know this before they actually do a sort of check. How do people motivate themselves? Well, again, as we talked about earlier on, neurotypicals are motivated by hierarchical considerations, which means that the idea of being applauded or of experiencing fellowship under pressure is something that's extremely motivating for autistics. And if they can combine the two in the world of sports or other achievements on a team basis and achieve a position in that, it's wonderful. This is not necessarily the same thing in the autistic world, because a lot of people applauding, well, that's a lot of people and a lot of noise, and we know how autistics feel about a lot of people and noise. But apart from that, the rush in the autistic world does come from something completely different. It starts out looking like this, as you probably know. There is the idea of, lining up the cars. If you ask the autistic girls, did you play with dolls when you were little? And her parents might say, well, actually, yes, she did. And this is where, of course, if you're not thinking what you're doing, you'll say, okay, well, played with dolls, and then she's probably not all that autistic. This is where you need to dig in and say, okay, what did you play with the dolls? Well, I didn't as much play with them, actually. I arranged them. And God help the poor sinner who started moving things about. Yes, exactly. So they were arranging things, and sometimes the same thing happens when you start talking to the boys. Oh, I was playing with Lego. Okay, how were you playing with Lego? Well, I was building things. Okay, were you also playing with, okay, give me that. No, don't that. No. As in, why would I be doing that? So the idea of constructing something or of mastering something, that's where the rush enters the world, and that's where you find autism spectrum condition motivation. Again, what did the people in the Department of Classics at the University of Copenhagen actually think they were doing? Well, basically, we were all into the rush of having a completely intricate, complicated Latin sentence and finally finding the solution to the puzzle. What was Titus Livius trying to say with this thing? Finally it adds up. Yes! And that's where you can go, the sort of thing that people normally do at sporting events if they're neurotypicals. They don't normally do that with Latin sentences, which is puzzling to autistics. How can you not solve a Latin sentence? How can you solve a Latin sentence and not immediately call for a celebration? Well, so again, another of the perfect observations from Temple Grandin. What does it feel like to be autistic, as Oliver Sacks asked her in the case story that comes from the collection that was named after the case story, An Anthropologist on Mars. You feel like an anthropologist on Mars. Wrong planet again. The point is that you are an outsider. And even though the natives may be very friendly and receptive and try to teach you their local customs and stuff, we don't really look at this picture and say, I wonder which one of them is Malinowski. And I'm not sure whether he will ever reach the level of his fellows here when it comes to doing whatever it is they're doing. And again, we might even say, if they sit down and talk about him, they might very well arrive at the conclusion that he has a very complex developmental disorder. It seems, first of all, that he's very sensitive to light. Photosensitivity, it's called. His skin can't handle very much sunlight. Apart from that, he's also very sensitive to touch. Instead of walking around barefoot, he's actually wearing these uncomfortable shoes. But if he tries to walk around without them, he'll go like this because of all the small rocks and stuff. Apart from that, he's probably sensitive to what they're eating, at least to a certain extent. And his approach to learning their language is also something that's rather complicated. Quite probably he'll have problems with some of the language sounds. So obviously, if he's autistic, he must be infantile autistic because he has problems with language sounds. And so we can continue the list and say, okay, yes, he's very different. And yes, to a certain extent, this difference will cause him a lot of problems if he's trying to lead exactly the same life as the tribesmen that he is among. So this is where the interesting question starts posing itself. Is it practical to have as the life goal of Malilowski that he should become completely indistinguishable from the natives? An interesting question is that of left-handedness. In most countries in the Western world these days, we don't consider left-handedness much of a problem, except in the very practical manner that says, well, if you're writing from left to right with your left hand, then yes, your hand is going to hit the ink that you just placed on the paper. But apart from that, so what? It's impractical if you're left-handed and they have, these very well-shaped pairs of scissors that fit a right hand like a glove, but are very uncomfortable if you try to use your left hand. In some cultures, it's still considered less acceptable to use your left hand. Sometimes for very practical reasons, if there is not much to wash your hands, then you use your right hand for eating and your left hand for something else. But it's also become a cultural tradition so that they still have, in some cases, the idea that it is satanic activity if you're left-handed. And this, of course, means that even in other countries, you sometimes have the idea that people say it's a problem that he's left-handed. It's a sort of handicap, and I don't want him to be made fun of at school. So what should I do? And obviously, yes, you can do something like that. And if the person is using the wrong hand as opposed to the right hand, yes, then you can try slapping them on the left hand. Interesting fact is that I think it's only now that they have even begun considering the idea of being left-handed in Japanese martial arts. The way to hold a Japanese sword is right hand on top. There is no other way. And if it's a traditional school, it's absolutely out of the question. If you're left-handed, don't be. Personally, I have the theory that when Musashi developed the two-sword style, he was possibly originally left-handed. And so the idea was that he discovered that he could do things with the left hand that many people couldn't. And since he was practicing with the sword, which gives you really strong arms, he probably discovered at some point, well, I can actually use two swords at the same time, which means I'm not left-handed, I'm both-handed, which is a better thing to be. So should we help people to not be left-handed? Should we help people to not be autistic? Yes, well, we have a dark chapter, one of many actually, but one of the dark chapters I'm talking about is from Denmark in the 1950s. Denmark is much greater than the small area you normally see because there is a group of innocent people who were colonized by the Danes, which now comprises the area of Greenland. And at some point, they decided that, well, Danish culture is much superior to Greenlandic culture, and for that reason, the best thing we can do is actually to, it's not called kidnapping if it's done by the state, but to forcibly remove the children from their homes and place them in Danish boarding schools and foster care so that they can become the new master race in Greenland, importing all the benefits of the glorious Danish culture. And this, of course, resulted in a lot of people being mentally broken. So this is a horrible chapter in the story of Denmark, and I like pointing this out because usually when people talk about the idea of inclusion in Danish schools, it means we want autistic children and everybody else in the same classroom, regardless of how they're feeling, because the school should be able to include everybody. And they sometimes use language from the American Deep South from the 1950s time, saying, okay, if we are placing autistics in special schools, we are not being nice to them, we are segregating them. Oh, that's morally wrong, we can't do that. And that's why I say, no, this is inclusion. The famous Greenland experiment, this is where you included people who should have been allowed not to be included, but to remain in their culture. And we know, by the way, from the United States, what happens if we have a culture that does not respect all cultures equally and take the necessary steps, not just what seems easy on the surface. The 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision was reached, upon other things, by means of psychological experimentation. Clark and Clark made some very fascinating studies where they decided to have children with different skin color and present them with dolls with different skin color. And the interesting result they arrived at was that, well, if you have a white child and you present the child with different colors in respect to the dolls, they will grab the white doll and say, okay, I like this one. Why do you like this one? Because it's the prettiest. Okay, probably not surprising. Then you get a black child. What does the black child do? In all too many cases, it grabs the white doll, and when asked, okay, which doll do you think is the prettiest? The white one. And this is where you can say, okay, something is wrong if they consider the prettiest doll to be the white one simply because it's white. And this is the problem that you can actually arrive at if you try to include autistics in non-autistic-friendly environments. If you can create an environment where everybody can be together without being stressed and overloaded, wonderful, please do that. But if you don't, then the autistics will always be lagging behind and feeling inferior. There was an experiment at some point where someone interviewed some Danish students at a special school for dyslexic children. And they had the idea that, oh, it must be horrible to be excluded from the general school system. But the interesting thing was that these students said, no, it was wonderful to get excluded because in normal school I felt like an idiot because everybody could read much better than I could. And some of them actually also told me so. But wasn't it sad to leave all your nice teachers? I didn't have that many nice teachers. I had teachers who couldn't understand my problem and accused me of being lazy or stupid or probably both. Here I have teachers who are nice to me, who understand my problem, and who can actually help me overcome my problem instead of saying that I have to figure it out for myself. So where we put people and how we put them there does matter, and sometimes putting them in the right place for the right reason obviously trumps putting them in the wrong place for the wrong reason. So when we talk about inclusion in Denmark, is it because we are talking about the family of humanity, we're all together in this, or is it simply a matter of, as a Danish politician, who I am very ashamed to say is still part of Danish politics, has said, well, all these cuckoo children are actually spending so much money that should be spent on the right children in the school system. This is where I say, okay, last time I heard rhetoric like that was in Germany in the 1930s, and I thought we'd agreed that we didn't want to go there again. So, for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Very fair. Please climb that tree. This cartoon is the one that, by the way, has given the result of the fake Einstein quote circulating on Facebook, that if you measure the intelligence of a fish by its capacity to climb a tree, you will not arrive at something useful. Einstein didn't really say that. It's an explanation of the cartoon. But this does not make it any less true, of course. Can autistics contribute to the world? Yes, of course. Quite a lot of fantastic phenomena are being presented to the world by autistics and have been for centuries. Socrates had a way of behaving, if we start reading his descriptions in Plato, where you can say we don't always feel completely confident of how much of the description of Socrates with Plato was historically accurate, but he had to be inspired from somewhere. So at least, if it wasn't Socrates, then perhaps it was Plato's father, but someone was obviously autistic in the Asperger range around the year 400 and something before Christ. And someone probably had a cousin who was also, because if we look at the Acropolis and especially the Parthenon Temple, one of the fascinating things about that temple is that the floor has a slight, well-calculated deviation. It's slightly higher at the middle than at the edges. And we're talking about a difference like the size of a small box of matches. This was calculated precisely and executed precisely because if the floor on the temple in that side had been completely as we would have expected, there would be a visual illusion because of the structure of the rest of the temple that would make it look as if it were going like that. So you have to build it like this so that when you look at it, it looks like it's perfectly balanced and perfectly in accordance and perfectly lined up. So someone has calculated the exact angle necessary for a temple that is, well, about the size of this complete room. And someone else has been there executing that plan. No normal people can do that. And of course, quantum physics, I don't really need to go that much into the fact that people who dabble in quantum physics at that level aren't normal either. There was the famous duel between Einstein and Bohr, where Bohr thought that Einstein had a point that he couldn't quite conquer, but he decided to work on a rebuttal, which he did all night. Instead of falling asleep, he simply kept working at it, and of course came out wide-eyed, quite awake the next day, which again is not normal behavior. Thomas Edison was renowned for not just inventing the light bulb, but also for persisting when the damn thing didn't do what he wanted it to. So why did you give up after attempt number, God knows what, 98? Well, because I thought that this was just the 98th version of how not to do it, and that meant I was getting closer to the result. This is where you can say, okay, what would normal people do? Well, after the 30th attempt, probably Edison, if he had been normal, would have said, all right, guys, let's stop this nonsense. We'll go for a beer, get drunk, and next Monday we'll try finding a real job. Given all these differences, how then are we supposed to teach children with autistic features? A lot of this is now well-known material, not least thanks to a lot of the people who have been speaking here the last couple of days. So what you can say is, from an overall point of view, autistics are people who very much need the presence of a model, of a manual of how to do things, because otherwise they will feel confused about what exactly is it that you want me to do. we need to know exactly what you're trying to make us do when we write a summary. It means actually write something that's shorter in your own words. Don't use your own words, but use the words you would be using if you were not as verbose as you actually are because you're on Asperger, that sort of thing. We always need to know the meaning and purpose of things, and sometimes we need to get philosophical because otherwise we'll get bogged down suddenly in how can we actually recognize or know or acquire knowledge of anything. How can we get creative? Creativity sounds like a paradox. Why do we have to study literature? Because it's all lies. We know that because Plato told us so. There it was again. Well, because it's a way of communicating the truth about human personality without getting sued, as Jane Austen explained, with a little paraphrase at the end. So there are a lot of things where you can say, we need to do this because this is the way we understand the world, and because if we don't do it this way, this is where the world becomes toxic for us, just like being excluded, no matter how much you use the word inclusion, will be toxic for everybody else. And just as we have noticed that people have to acquire a black identity in the United States, there is also a path to acquiring an autistic identity and becoming comfortable with yourself. Especially given the fact that, again, everybody in our time is living as if we were having one long reception. This is very hard for autistic people, and this is also where sometimes we can use the spoon model, where you can say you wake up every morning with perhaps 8 spoons, but you have to realize that every activity, even getting out of bed and taking a shower, costs you in terms of spoons. And given that, you need to be able to do a sort of balancing of your energy, of saying, how much can I achieve today if I have to make it safely to my bed tonight? Can it be possible under these circumstances to have relations with other people? Actually, yes. There is a wonderful model because yes, there seems to be a tendency that autistic marriages do tend to work, but it's not impossible. So if you happen to be in an autistic neurotypical marriage and you're fearing the worst, well, sometimes finding ways of communicating is exactly what's needed. As the person says here, it's not something you can turn off. A part of me is always detached, abstracting, looking at numbers and patterns. When we should be closest, part of me is still so alone, counting the touches of her fingertips. Touch, 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 touch. Wait, that's the Fibonacci sequence. Whatever I did to deserve you, it couldn't have been enough. So how do you express love in this fashion? This is one example. So yes, there is a danger if we focus on the differences as which race is the purer. And as we know, this sort of focus invariably ends up with something, and usually someone, going up in flames. Sometimes spontaneously, sometimes in a much more well-planned fashion. One of the explanations of the feelings and the execution is, of course, wonderfully done by Leonard Cohen, First We Take Manhattan. But we also know that if we say, okay, we truly try to understand each other, to find out what does the world look like from the other side, this is the basis of that wonderful expression that if we do that, we can finally experience freedom at last, sitting down together at the table of brotherhood, as the wonderful words of the late Reverend Dr. King still live among us. And if we do that, there is actually no limit to what we might achieve, because the idea of wanting to understand, of wanting to create a truly working together atmosphere, is where we find out that there is no end, actually, to the opportunities afforded us. And with those words, with only a small delay, I'm sorry to say, we have the situation, what I say, thank you for your attention, with this wonderful picture that also illustrates the day in each life of autistic people. So thank you for not running away screaming.
Christian, thank you very much. I enjoyed that tremendously, and I think everybody else did too, yes? On behalf of the conference, thank you so much for your
Sacred
presentation.
Blanket. Thank you very much.